Hi there, Booktube. It's Roz. It's the end of September, and I'm getting ahead with my September wrap up because of clearing the decks for Victober in October. Now, I finished 18 books in September, so I have split this wrap up into two halves, and I've done one video about the 12 things I read for Shorty September, which were a joy and a delight, and if you like short books, watch that one. And this one, I'm going to just quickly talk about the other 6 books that I finished this month. 2 of the books that I read were for the Booktubers Prize, and that's Young Mungo by Douglas Stewart and Trust by Hernan Diaz. Now, those were for the Booktube Prize final round. I've done a ratings video explaining how my going from bottom to top of the 6 books I read for the fiction finals, but apart from that, my lips are sealed, so that will appear in a few days' time, and all will be revealed. Now, apart from Shorty September, there were 2 other reading events that I sort of took part in September, and one was Shakey, reading Shakespeare. Now, Too Tight Lautrec slightly rescued me from neglecting Shakey this year, because I didn't read any plays, but the Shakey Sonnets show restarted, and I got dug back into Shakespeare's sonnets alongside Too Tight, and I will link to the Shakey Sonnets show below, so you can do the same if you want. So that was September for me, but that wasn't one of the 4 books that I finished. Another event new this September was Shorty September, which is hosted by Scott of Gunpowder Fiction and Plot, and is encouraging us to read Australian books, because he's worrying that Australian books are not getting the attention that they deserve. He's probably right. And I read 2 things for that. Both of them on Kindle, so I can't wave them at you. But now one of those was When the Ground is Hard by Malla Nunn, which came out in 2019. And it's by an Australian author, but she actually grew up in Eswatini, or Swaziland as it was when she was growing up there, and left as a teenager or a young woman and moved to Australia. So not only was it my one of my Shorty September choices, but it's also the first book that I've read by an author from Eswatini. So I will do a standalone scallydandling video about that one. Suffice to say that it's a good young adult book, and worth reading, because she writes well, and also it reflects the intense racial divisions that there were in Swaziland in the 1960s, but kind of through the experiences of a teenage schoolgirl who's would describe herself as coloured. Her father's a white South African, and her mother is a coloured woman from Swaziland, Swazi woman, but a kind of mixed race, and those things were terribly important at the time, and sort of defined who you mixed with, which school you could go to, what your economic kind of prospects were, all sorts of things. So definitely a good read, and I will say more about it in the scallydandling video. The other Australian book I read was The Performance by Claire Thomas, which came out in 2021, and that was one of the first books I read this month, and is absolutely one of my top reads of September 2024. I imagine it will be there in my reads of the year. Why? Well, it's a beautifully written book, very intense. It takes place in the course of one evening, and there are 3 women in a theatre in Melbourne, I think it is, and 2 are in the audience, and one is a student who's working there. That's her part-time job as a theatre usher, and they are all watching the play by Samuel Beckett called Happy Days, and So it's intense because it's a whole novel, but in a short time. It's almost like you're reading it in real time. Like you have the first half and the interval and the second half, but you get all three women's lives. You get Claire Thomas covers climate change and the phases of women's lives and how their lives change over time and what affects that. She writes about sort of drama and the theatre and art and what that means to us, about philanthropy, about relationships. It packs so much, and brilliantly, she links all of that back to the Beckett play, Happy Days, and, makes all of it interconnect. What a good book. Thank you so much, Scott, for originally bringing the performance to my attention when it came out a couple of years ago, and then running Shorty September, which gave me the added push to actually read it this year. So thank you. And if you haven't read the performance, this is a solid recommendation for me, particularly if you've also read a bit of Beckett, because it kind of adds another sort of frisson of interest to it. The next book I'm going to talk about is also particularly interesting if you read books by a particular author. Let me explain. Okay, this one was for my In Real Life book group, and it's The Magician by Colm Toibin. It also came out in 2021, and it is a fictionalized biography of the German author Thomas Mann, Nobel Prize winning Thomas Mann, that was writing in sort of the first half of the 20th century. Last year, I finally read The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. I'd read Death in Venice before and possibly something else, but I've been intimidated by the fatness and reputation of The Magic Mountain. But I read it, as I say, in the spring, along with a group of other people. We had a Voxer group that kind of carried us along, and I was so glad I did. It was one of my most memorable reads of 2022. And so I came to The Magician kind of primed with interest and, a curiosity about Thomas Mann's life. I wonder if I would have enjoyed this book as much if I hadn't read some of Mann's fiction. And I'd be interested if you've read The Magician and haven't read, say, The Magic Mountain or Buddenbrooks or whatever, how did you find it? Did it interest you? Because it's a very detailed follow through of Mann's life, and I think quite historically accurate, very historically accurate. But because it's fictionalized, rather than writing a factual biography, Toibin, by writing as a novel, he can put ideas into Mann's head, and express his thoughts, what he thinks may have been his thoughts and feelings, and which makes it perhaps more fun to read than a biography. At the same time, I was constantly wondering, what's the evidence for this? I think there was lots from his letters and so on, but when you have that kind of uncertainty about what's true and what isn't, what I think probably is true is he showed Mann's creative genius, but also his selfishness and his vanity and the way his views changed over his life, and he sort of rewrote his sort of personal narrative in his head, and we'd read the earlier bits and could see how he was almost really, really interesting. Interesting also to see one writer writing about another writer's creative process, and both Toibin and Mann are writers whose work I like and admire. So a good book for me, but I don't know if it would be for everyone. Tell me what you think. Oh, the other thing I suppose about it is that because Mann was born in 1875 and died in 1955, it gave Toibin the opportunity to write, the spread of history over Mann's life, the context, and, through Mann's life. And, those were tumultuous and important years for Europe, and particularly for Germany, where Mann was from. So that was, I suppose, another layer of interest for me. The final book that I read and finished this month was another backlist choice, A Passage to India by Ian Forster. Now, I am nearly to the end of a year of reading all of Forster's novels in publication order. So the last one that I'm going to read is Morris, which I'm reading in November, which was written before A Passage to India, but published posthumously. So that's publication order puts that one last. And I'm really looking forward to Morris. A Passage to India was a reread for me, and I wasn't sure if I would reread it, but I'm glad that I did. And this whole Forster thing is thanks to Jen, the librarian. So I should credit her for this. What can I say about A Passage to India? Forster's writing style is wonderful and I love it. But this is quite an uncomfortable book to read. Why is it uncomfortable? I think Forster means it to be an uncomfortable book to read because he assumes it is going to be read by British readers at the time that he published it in the 1920s. And he is reflecting back to his readers how the British are behaving in India, how they treat Indian people, how the assumptions that they make about, the British Empire and the value of the British ruling in India. And I think Forster would have seen himself as forward-thinking on this topic, and he had been to visit India. He'd worked there for a short time, working for an Indian ruler, but within the overall sort of British Raj context. And, I think he felt that qualified him to write a book set in India and that was about both the British in India, which he nails, I think, really well, but also about Indians at the time. And there was two sort of difficulties about this book for me. One was the discomfort of thinking, God, weren't we awful in India? And that was what Forster meant me to think. And it's like a bit of a tragedy. Everything that happens, you're thinking like, oh God, no, how awful! Oh no, I can see how this is going to turn out. One of those sorts of books. That sort of Thomas Hardy sort of feeling. Where you can see where things are going and you don't like it. But also, what Forster does is he makes sweeping generalizations about how people think. And when he was doing that about sort of Anglo-Indians, English people in India, it was probably unfair, but felt fair enough to me. But when he was doing that about Indian people of different sort of classes and backgrounds, and Hindus and Muslims, and but sort of basically sort of saying, oh, the Oriental mind thinks this, or the Indian mentality is this, or the Muslims behave like this. That was problematic. So and obviously he was writing at the time from his experience and as and with the best of intentions. So you have to read it in that spirit, but it still made it a slightly edgy read for me, shall we say. There we go. So that was my non-Shorty September reads. I would love to hear about the wonderful things that you read in September. Really interested in your opinions on A Passage to India, whether you felt a similar kind of discomfort to me, but whilst, reveling in the wonders of Forster's prose and his sardonic sort of wit. And do read the performance and and now roll on October and Victober. I'm so looking forward to that.